The screen is black. A single whisper cuts through the silence. They tried to burn it. They thought the flames would erase the truth, but you can still smell the smoke of what they wanted forgotten. Charleston, South Carolina, 1829. A storm. A mansion. Two women giving birth within hours of each other. One a French countess, draped in silk, the other her slave, drenched in sweat and fear. By dawn, two infants were gone. In their place, two strangers' destinies, switched forever. Understand this. What you are about to hear is not just a story. It is a revelation. And revelation is dangerous. Because once you see the machinery of deception, once you realize how the powerful bend fate itself, you cannot return to blindness. Picture it. The Peton Mansion. An empire built on cotton and rice, where wealth flowed like blood. Marble floors polished by hands that would never walk free. Crystal chandeliers that glittered like constellations stolen from the heavens. Beneath that elegance, secrets rotted. Countess Margot de Villefort, a woman of French nobility, newly imported into Charleston society, carrying the grace of Versailles but the desperation of exile. And Celeste, her personal attendant, a woman born into chains yet educated in both French and English, her mind sharper than any blade her master ever carried. Two women trapped in the same cage of a man's dominion but divided by skin and law. Their master, Colonel Harrison Peton, was a man who played the role of Southern aristocrat with flawless precision. Councilman, planter, host of lavish dinners where wine flowed as freely as whispers. But at night, when no one was watching, he followed the oldest, most brutal pattern of power. He descended into the slave quarters, as countless planters did before him, exercising a right society never condemned but always denied. From these visits, Celeste conceived. Meanwhile, Margot's own secret swelled inside her. Her child was not her husband's. It was the doctor's, Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, a French revolutionary exile who carried with him dangerous ideas about freedom and forbidden passions. And so, two women grew heavier with futures that could not coexist. Two pregnancies, two impossible truths. Now, listen carefully. This is where power becomes most insidious. The aristocrat's wife could not bear a child that looked like her lover. The slave could not raise a son who carried the colonel's unmistakable features without inviting suspicion, punishment, or death. Both children were destined to destroy everything if they were recognized for what they truly were. And so, on that storm-torn night, an exchange was whispered into existence. A pact. A lie birthed into flesh. Celeste's boy, pale enough to pass as white, would be claimed as the colonel's heir. Margot's daughter, with darker skin and eyes that carried her father's revolutionary fire, would be condemned to grow up in bondage. Think about that. An empire was preserved by sacrificing two newborns to deception. And here's the darkness most men never see. Power is not always taken by force. Sometimes it is rearranged quietly in the cradle. Mama Ruth, the old midwife who had delivered 3 generations of Charleston children, was the only one who saw the full picture that night. She held the babies in her hands. She looked into their faces and knew immediately whose blood flowed in whose veins. And she kept the secret, not out of loyalty, not out of fear, but because she understood what every slave midwife in the South understood. Family was a fragile illusion, and survival required silence. The storm outside roared like judgment, but inside, a darker storm brewed, a pact that would ripple through history, contaminating bloodlines, fortunes, and the very structure of American society. The Peton name would rise higher than ever, their legitimate heir sitting atop wealth that did not belong to him. Meanwhile, Margot's daughter, destined to brilliance, would bend her back under the yoke of her own mother's betrayal. This is the beginning of the descent, but it's only the first veil, because behind this single exchange was something bigger, something that extended beyond Charleston, a system, a hidden pattern repeated in other mansions, on other plantations, in other dynasties, a pattern of swapping, of disguising bloodlines, of bending lineage to serve power. And if you believe this was an isolated act of desperation, you are already falling for the illusion they wanted you to believe. You see, history is not written in ink. It is written in fire, in hidden bargains, in lies protected by silence. What they told you about the antebellum South, the grandeur, the nobility, the honor of the old world transplanted into America, that was theater. The real story is one of corruption so intimate, so personal, that it began in the womb and the cradle. And that night in 1829, when two babies were exchanged by candlelight while rain pounded the mansion's glass, a dynasty was not just preserved, it was cursed. Because when you build an empire on a lie, the lie eventually devours the empire. Pause. Now, before we descend further, I need you to feel this, really feel it. What if you discovered your entire life, your identity, your family, was engineered in this way? Not just a deception, but a deliberate manipulation by those who controlled you before you even had a name. That is the true horror of history. Not the battles, not the politics, but the control of Bloodline itself. And in Charleston, the Peton deception would fester for decades, until the Civil War tore the veil and revealed just enough of the truth to bring it all crashing down. But remember, the full truth was never meant to be told. They tried to burn it in 1923 when a courthouse fire devoured the records. Convenient, wasn't it? Just as whispers of inheritance lawsuits and strange discrepancies began surfacing, just as the descendants of Peton blood and not Peton blood collided in a storm of betrayal. Tonight, you're going to walk through those ashes with me, step by step, secret by secret, layer by layer, and if you stay until the end, you will not just understand the Peton deception, you will understand the system of control itself. But understand this as well. Once you cross the threshold, there is no going back. Do you feel it yet? That slow pull beneath your feet? That's not just the past drawing you in. It's the realization that this wasn't a single night of desperation. It was a blueprint, a ritual of power. By the summer of 1831, the exchange was complete. The colonel embraced the infant boy as his heir without hesitation. He never questioned the child's pale skin, the familiar curve of the Peton nose, the way the baby's tiny fists already clenched with what he called family strength. He announced the birth with champagne at his dinner parties, sending embossed invitations to Charleston's elite. In the newspapers, the boy was listed as Harrison Peton II, heir to 3,000 acres of low-country wealth. And Celeste? She stood at the edge of the drawing room holding her daughter, the child she had birthed but could never claim. The baby girl had Margot's eyes, dark and golden at once, and Celeste's own hair texture. She was now called Rose, a name chosen by the Countess, but spoken mostly in whispers by the kitchen staff. She was listed in the household ledger as property, an asset. At 3 months old, stop and breathe, look at that ledger in your mind's eye. On one line, a boy recorded as heir, his future preordained with ink and wax seals. On the next, a girl recorded as property, her future preordained with iron and rope. 2 infants born of the same storm, separated by one signature. This is the quiet machinery of power, not the public spectacles, not the gallows or the courts. Paper, ink, ledgers, records. That's how dynasties are built, and that's how they are stolen. Mama Ruth knew it better than anyone. In the months that followed, she became the silent architect of the deception. She coached Celeste on how to behave as though nothing had changed. She taught the Countess how to hold her tongue when people compared her son's complexion to the colonel's. She burned certain afterbirth cloths in the fire pit behind the kitchen, erasing what little physical proof might exist. Dr. Rousseau handled the records. As a physician to Charleston's elite, he had access to medical books, baptismal registries, and private correspondences. With a few carefully timed entries and some French handwriting no clerk could decipher, the births were permanently misfiled. But a deception of this magnitude is never perfect. Servants whispered. A kitchen girl claimed she saw Celeste's baby being carried into the main house before dawn. A stable boy swore he heard the Countess crying, "My daughter," as she left the cottage. These rumors drifted through the quarters like smoke. But smoke dissipates when no one dares to fan it into flame. And yet, something darker was happening, something none of them fully grasped. Because this single exchange, this one night's deception, was part of a much larger network of line corrections, quietly operating across the South. Yes, network. If you've never heard of this, you're not alone. The archives that survived hint at it only in fragments. A letter from a Louisiana judge, a burned diary from a Savannah matron, a cryptic note in a Virginia ledger marked BNP, blood not pure. Elite families, desperate to preserve appearances, quietly rearranged bloodlines when scandal threatened them. They swapped infants between enslaved women and mistresses, forged baptismal certificates, even paid midwives to disappear or lose records. They called it practicality. It was a hidden aristocracy within an aristocracy, shaping inheritance and power. Charleston in the 1830s was the jewel of this system, and the Peton mansion was its crucible. The Countess knew it was monstrous. She wrote as much in a hidden diary, fragments of which surfaced briefly before the 1923 courthouse fire erased them. In a trembling French hand, she described the night she would sneak into the quarters just to watch her daughter sleeping in a rough wooden crib, whispering lullabies that no one would ever acknowledge as a mother's. She described how Celeste would avoid her gaze, how the distance between them grew heavier than the chains Celeste still wore. Celeste, for her part, endured. Her boy, the boy she had given up, grew fat and pampered in the main house, wearing tailored baby clothes from Paris, while her daughter wore coarse homespun cloth. Celeste fed him from a bottle she prepared with her own hands, never allowed to reveal the truth. She buried her fury beneath layers of obedience, but it leaked out in small ways. A look, a pause, a tremor in her voice when she spoke the word "Madam." And Colonel Peton, he was blind to it all, or rather he chose to. Be blind, because men like him always know more than they admit. They can smell scandal like blood in the water, but when the lie protects them, they call it truth. This is the kind of power they don't teach you about. It's not the power of guns or armies, it's the power of narrative. The power to decide what a child is, who they belong to, what future they deserve. That power is godlike. It shapes entire generations without a single law being passed. And once you start to see it, you realize it's still alive today, hidden behind birth certificates, social programs, even algorithms. The machinery changes shape, but the purpose remains the same. Right now, as you're listening, your mind is starting to map the pattern. You're starting to see how a single forged record can change a bloodline, a fortune, a destiny. That realization is dangerous, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And the people who built these systems count on you never seeing it. I want you to do something for me, not as a gimmick, but as a signal that you're awake, that you're not just consuming this story, but stepping into it. Go to the comments right now and type twice, "Blood remembers." Type it exactly like that, twice. Why? Because repetition imprints identity. It's how oaths are sealed, how initiations work. This is your signal to the algorithm and to yourself that you're no longer just an observer, you're someone who remembers. Because if blood remembers, so does history. Now, let's return to Charleston. The years after the exchange were outwardly calm. Harrison Peton II grew into a precocious boy, praised for his natural leadership. He learned to ride at 4, read at 5, and by 7 was reciting Latin phrases at his father's dinner table. His mother, Celeste, watched from the shadows as he was molded into a Peton, into the kind of man who would one day inherit everything she had been denied. Meanwhile, Rose, Margot's daughter, was growing in the quarters, nimble and sharp-eyed. She picked up languages quickly, mimicking her mother's aristocratic French without even realizing it. By 10, she was sneaking into the library at night to read by candlelight. Her mind was a mirror of her birth father's, Dr. Rousseau's, brilliant and restless. She was a storm trapped in a cage, and beneath it all, the secret tightened like a noose. Because secrets like this don't stay buried, they ferment, they draw flies, they call to anyone hungry for leverage, and by the time the Civil War began to churn the South into chaos, the Peton deception was already cracking at the seams. But that unraveling, the murders, the lawsuits, the fire, that's still ahead of us. For now, understand this, the deadly pact of 1829 was not just an act of desperation, it was a door. And once it opened, a whole corridor of hidden manipulations spilled into the light. We're walking down that corridor, no. For 15 years, the house on East Bay Street appeared serene, the marble polished, the dinner parties exquisite, the air radiant. But serenity is only the surface of deep water. Beneath, currents churn unseen. Harrison Peton II, the boy who should have been a slave, had become the darling of Charleston society. Tutors praised his wit. Judges patted his head at courthouse steps. Other planters spoke of his destiny to become a statesman like his father. He rode a white stallion at fox hunts while a small, dark-eyed girl named Rose polished silver in the kitchen. They were the same storm's children raised on opposite sides of a lie. By 1845, that lie was starting to hum with a low, electric tension. Servants whispered that the boy and the girl sometimes stared at each other with uncanny recognition. Mama Ruth, now in her 80s, watched from the corner of rooms, her hands trembling as she kneaded bread. She alone remembered the moment of exchange. She alone knew that the future of an empire rested on a silence she had sworn to keep, and yet silences had a way of breaking. One evening in late summer, a visitor arrived at the Peton mansion, a man named Silas Crowder, a drifter with sharp eyes and sharper instincts. He had once been a clerk at the Charleston City Records office, where Dr. Rousseau's forged entries still sat. Crowder was a small man, but small men often see what giants overlook. He'd pieced together fragments, dates that didn't match, signatures that didn't align, a baptism performed twice. And now he was on the Peton doorstep with a proposition. Colonel Peton had grown older, heavier, more suspicious. He had started sleeping in a separate wing of the mansion, his health eroded by drink and the humidity of the low country. When Crowder asked to speak privately, the colonel's first instinct was irritation. But irritation turned to dread when Crowder began to describe the night of the births in unnerving detail. "I know which child is yours," Crowder said softly, his hand resting on a folded paper. "And I know which isn't." This is the moment when the quiet machinery of power turns violent, because secrets are currency, and men who control empires do not part with currency willingly. 3 days later, Silas Crowder was found floating in the Cooper River. His death was ruled an accident, a drunken stumble off the pier. The paper he carried vanished. The coroner, a man whose plantation mortgage was held by Colonel Peton, signed the report without a second glance. The message was clear, but the killing did not erase the problem. It deepened it, because murder leaves echoes. Gossip swelled in Charleston drawing rooms. Dr. Rousseau, still practicing medicine in the city, but now an aging man with his own skeletons, heard the rumors. He confronted the Countess in a fevered midnight meeting at the back of St. Philip's Church, accusing her of letting the colonel solve their problem with blood. She did not deny it. "I did what I had to do to protect our daughter," she said, her voice shaking. "If you had loved her as you claim, you would have found another way." But Rousseau saw through her words. The Countess was no longer the desperate young exile of 1831. She had become something colder, forged by years of deception, a woman capable of sacrificing not only her daughter but her conscience to preserve her standing. And Rose? She was now 16, tall and brilliant. She had begun teaching herself to write in secret, filling scraps of paper with French phrases she remembered from the Countess's lullabies. She moved through the mansion like a ghost, aware of eyes on her, aware of something wrong in the way the air looked at her, not as a servant but as something familiar. In the quarters at night, she whispered questions to Mama Ruth. "Why does the mistress look at me like that? Why does she speak to me in French when no one's listening?" Mama Ruth would shake her head and say, "Child, some truths burn hotter than fire. Don't go reaching for them." But fire was already reaching for her, because in 1848 Colonel Peton's health collapsed. On his deathbed, he summoned his heir, Harrison II, to give him the keys to the vault and the deeds to the plantations. Celeste, still a slave in name but effectively the governess of her own son, stood in the doorway. And the Countess, pale and trembling, hovered at the colonel's side. The old man pressed the iron key into his son's hand, muttering, "Everything I built, boy. Everything I built is yours." And then he died. The empire passed to a young man who was never meant to inherit it, a young man whose entire identity was a legal fiction. The Countess should have been relieved. Her scheme had succeeded. The colonel was dead, the inheritance secured, but something in her had cracked. She had spent 17 years sneaking glances at her real child, Rose, growing up in bondage. She had watched Celeste's stoic suffering, and some deep, aristocratic arrogance in her had begun to erode. At night she would creep into the quarter, stand at the edge of Rose's cot and whisper, "Forgive me." But Rose did not forgive. She was too smart, too aware. She had begun piecing together her own origin story from overheard whispers, and the way the Countess's eyes lingered on her, and she hated her for it. This is where history becomes mythic, because we have no full records of what happened next, only fragments. Testimony from a freedman decades later. A letter from Dr. Rousseau's niece. Hints that Rose tried to run away and was caught. Hints that she was locked in the root cellar for days. Hints that she swore in that dark hole to bring the Peton name down even if it meant her life. And somewhere in that same time, Dr. Rousseau died suddenly. Heart failure at 55. Some said it was natural. Some said it was poison. No one investigated. By 1850, the Peton household was a haunted stage. The heir sat in the master's chair, but his hands trembled when he signed documents. The Countess stared at nothing for long stretches, as if seeing ghosts. Celeste walked the halls like a shadow of vengeance. And Rose had become a storm. Here's what you need to see. This is not just a family drama. It's a template. The same men who forged this system also forged the institutions that would cover it up. Courts, churches, banks. Blackmail, forgery, and murder were simply tools to protect the deeper mechanism, bloodline control. The Petons were just one example. There were others. And that's why this story matters, because you are living inside the descendants of that same machinery. When you hear about lost records or fires or clerical errors in today's world, understand that's the same hand at work. That's how power hides its origin. The Peton deception was cracking, but before it exploded, it reached its darkest point. And in that darkness, two lives would collide violently, the heir who wasn't and the slave girl who was. We're approaching that collision now. By the dawn of the 1850s, the Peton mansion had grown quieter, but not calmer. The colonel was gone. The Countess had retreated into a shadow of herself, no longer hosting dinners, no longer playing the piano for Charleston's elite. Harrison Peton II now presided over the house. At 20, he had the posture of a young aristocrat, but eyes that never quite settled. He had inherited land, wealth, and power. What he hadn't inherited was belonging. Rose was now 19, her hair pinned back with scraps of ribbon she saved from discarded packages. She had grown tall and fierce-eyed, a figure of quiet defiance in the kitchen and the stables. She'd become known among the other slaves for her sharp mind, her ability to read the white folks like a book. She wasn't free, not yet, but she had begun to think like someone who would be, and between them, something electric had begun to coil. Harrison II often watched her when he thought no one noticed, in the way she carried herself, in the way her amber eyes seemed to flash like his mother's, in the way she spoke fragments of French under her breath when she thought she was alone. Something in him recognized her without knowing why. One humid evening, as dusk fell and cicadas screamed from the oaks, he called her to the library. It was a room he'd rarely entered as a boy, but Rose had been sneaking in for years. The books smelled of leather and dust. The shutters were closed against the heat. "Sit," he said, though his voice lacked the command of a master. Rose stood. "What do you want, sir?" He poured himself a glass of brandy he'd stolen from his father's cabinet. His hands shook. "I want to know," he said, "why you look at me like that." Her eyes narrowed. "Like what?" "Like you know something I don't." Silence stretched between them. The only sound was the cicadas and the faint creak of the shutters. Rose felt Mama Ruth's warnings in her bones. Some truths burn hotter than fire, but she was done swallowing flames. "Maybe I do," she said softly. "Maybe I know who you really are." He laughed, but it came out hollow. "I'm Harrison Peton II, he said, "owner of this house, of this land, of you." Rose stepped closer. "You don't own me," she said, her voice low. "You never did. You've been living in my skin your whole life." Something in his face changed then. Not anger, but confusion laced with fear. "What are you talking about?" "You know what I'm talking about." She leaned in until he could see the flecks of gold in her eyes. "Look at me. Look at my face. Look at yours. Whose nose do you think you have? Whose blood do you think runs through your veins?" He backed away, shaking his head. No, it's true." Her voice broke, but she didn't stop. "You're not his son. You're Celeste's, my mother's. You're the one who should have been in the quarters. I'm the one who should have been in this room." He stared at her, white-knuckled around his glass. The air seemed to crackle. In that moment, everything his life had been built upon, the inheritance, the lessons, the identity, tilted like a ship in a storm. "Who told you this?" he demanded, but his voice cracked on the last word. "I didn't need anyone to tell me," she said. "I've known since I was a child, the way your mother looks at me, the way she speaks to me in French, the way Mama Ruth won't meet my eyes. You were born in my place, and I was born in yours." For a long time neither spoke. Outside, thunder rolled over the harbor. He set the glass down with a trembling hand. "If this is true," he began but couldn't finish. Rose crossed her arms. "If this is true, then every meal you've eaten, every lesson you've learned, every acre you've inherited belongs to me, and every lash, every chain, every stolen hour of my life belongs to you." He looked at her then, really looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, at the reflection of his own features in hers, and for the first time, shame hit him like a blow. "This can't get out," he whispered. "It would ruin everything." She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "It already ruined everything." This was the moment the pact began to collapse. Not with a revelation in a courtroom, but with two young people staring at each other across a gulf of stolen lives. That night, Harrison didn't sleep. He tore through old papers, letters, anything he could find in his father's desk. He found baptismal certificates, a faded scrap of French handwriting, and an old ledger page with two names written in the same ink but different hands. He began to see the pattern, and Rose, back in the quarters, sat awake too, staring at the ceiling. She thought of her mother Celeste, who had given up her son so Rose could live. She thought of the Countess, who had whispered lullabies through the bars of her cradle. She thought of everything that had been taken from her, and she began to plan. This is how dynasties die, not with a single blow, but with an awakening, with the moment the stolen recognize themselves and the inheritors recognize the theft. In the months that followed, the mansion became a battlefield of glances and silences. Harrison II avoided Rose but couldn't stop thinking about her. He stopped attending social gatherings. He stopped signing documents. He began drinking heavily, haunted by visions of the chain around his wrist instead of the keys in his hand. The Countess sensed the shift immediately. She cornered Rose one morning in the pantry, her face pale and drawn. "What did you tell him?" she hissed in French. Rose stared back. "I told him the truth." The Countess's hands trembled. "You don't understand what you've done." "Oh, I understand," Rose said, "better than you ever did." In that instant, Margot de Villefort saw what she had created. Not just an exchange, not just a deception, a reckoning. And outside the mansion walls, the country itself was beginning to tremble. Abolitionist pamphlets spread through Charleston like smuggled fire. Fugitive slaves whispered of a coming war. Networks of spies and informants watched every household. The Peton secret was no longer just a private sin. It was a powder keg in a city about to ignite. Secrets, once awakened, don't sleep again. They grow teeth. We're entering the final descent now, the part of the story where the pact births violence, betrayal, and the fire that tried to erase it all. By 1852, the Peton estate was no longer a home. It was a haunted citadel. The Countess had grown thin and restless, pacing corridors at night. Harrison II drank himself numb, muttering to shadows. Celeste moved like a silent force through the quarters, her eyes fixed on Rose with a knowing sadness. And Rose had stopped being afraid. She had started speaking in the quarters at night, not just whispers but declarations. "We are not what they say we are. Their names, their papers, their records, all lies, and lies can be burned." She gathered the younger ones around her, teaching them letters by candlelight, scribbling words in dirt. She spoke of freedom as though it were not a dream, but a clock ticking toward midnight. And midnight was coming. The Countess felt it. Her scheme, once so precise, was collapsing under its own weight. She had wanted only to save her daughter, but in saving her, she had created an enemy. Rose looked at her not as a mother, but as a betrayer. And Harrison, the false heir, had become a danger. He had begun leaving cryptic notes on the dining table, scrawled in shaking script. "Who am I? Who is she?" He'd woken once screaming that he saw chains on his wrists. The lie was devouring him. Mathieu, one humid night, a confrontation broke open. Harrison staggered into the quarters, drunk, his lantern swinging wildly. He burst into Rose's room, eyes glassy, hair damp with sweat. Tell me again, he demanded, slurring. Tell me who I am. Rose sat up slowly. Her mother stirred in the corner, but Rose raised a hand to keep her still. You already know, she said. His breath caught. If it's true, if I'm hers. He pointed at Celeste, his finger trembling. Then I am nothing. Nothing but a slave. Rose stood, her voice sharp. You are nothing because you believe the lies. You lived in my place, wore my life like a costume, and now you choke on it. Something broke inside him then. He lunged forward, gripping her shoulders. Switch with me, he whispered, desperation spilling from him. Take it. Take the house, the name, the land. Let me be free. But she shoved him back, her eyes blazing. There is no switch that can fix this. The past is carved in blood. You can't trade your chains for mine. They stood in silence, the lantern flickering between them, and then Celeste's voice, quiet but firm, cut the air. You're both right. They turned. She rose from the shadows, her face lined with years of silence. This house is built on stolen blood. One of you wears the chains, the other the crown, but neither belongs. If you stay here, it will kill you both. It was a prophecy more than advice, because the very next week, fire came. It began in the stables. Whether by accident or design, no one knew. But the flames leapt fast, fed by hay and pitch. By the time the bells rang, the barn was gone, and the fire had spread to the kitchen. Slaves and neighbors rushed with buckets, shouting prayers and curses. And in the chaos, Rose vanished. Some said she slipped into the marshes, guided by men from the Underground Railroad. Others whispered she was taken by men hired by the Countess, locked away to prevent exposure. A few claimed she died in the flames. The records are contradictory, deliberately so. What is clear is this: the fire destroyed more than buildings. It consumed ledgers, baptismal records, correspondence. Entire shelves of the Peton archive turned to ash that night, and when the smoke cleared, the story was rewritten again. Charleston newspapers reported it simply. Tragic fire at the Peton estate. No loss of life, though significant property destroyed. But the truth was more violent. In the confusion, a man's body was found near the riverbank, Harrison II's valet. His throat was cut. No explanation offered. Another silence purchased. And Harrison himself? He stumbled through the streets for weeks afterward, muttering to strangers, until finally disappearing from Charleston altogether. Some say he sailed to Havana under a false name. Some say he drank himself into a grave by the docks. His fate remains unrecorded, which is exactly how powerful families liked it. The Countess survived, but she was never seen in society again. She lived out her years behind shuttered windows, her fortune dwindling, her mind gnawed by guilt. Celeste, freed in the confusion after the fire, disappeared too. Some believe she followed her daughter north. And the Peton dynasty? It collapsed quietly. Within a decade, the estate was sold in parcels. The great house on East Bay Street stood empty for years, its charred beams a monument to secrets no one dared speak. But fragments of the truth survived, in letters, in whispers, in the lineage of those who knew their blood had been stolen, and who passed that knowledge down. Here is the lesson. Empires don't fall only when armies march. They fall when lies burn, when a single hidden truth, a birth, a switch, a name, bursts into flame and cannot be put out. The Peton fire was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Because secrets like this do not die. They wait. They bleed forward through generations, shaping the present with the silence of the past. And you are sent, standing in their ashes now. Charleston is quiet now. The Peton house stands hollow, its windows boarded, its staircases warped, its garden overtaken by vines. Tourists pass by without knowing. They see a ruin. They don't see the room where two babies were exchanged, where a dynasty was forged on deception. They don't feel the weight of a pact signed not with ink but with blood. But the walls still whisper. Because the Peton affair was not an isolated tragedy. It was a rehearsal, a template, a way of laundering bloodlines, of moving power invisibly across racial and class boundaries. And once it worked in Charleston, it was copied. Not in the exact form, but in spirit, in New Orleans, in Savannah, in Baltimore, in Havana. Anywhere there were fortunes to inherit, reputations to protect, and forbidden children to hide. You think you're hearing a story about a countess and a slave. You're not. You're hearing how entire families, entire systems learn to shape reality itself. They switched more than babies. They switched truth and falsehood, freedom and bondage, history and myth. By the time the Civil War erupted, dozens of estates across the South held secrets like the Petons, forged baptismal records, vanishing infants, wills rewritten in the dead of night, judges, lawyers, and midwives all complicit. Some did it for survival, most did it for power. This is why the Emancipation Proclamation, for all its moral force, was only a partial ending. Slavery as a legal status ended, but the bloodlines remained hidden, the stolen inheritances unreturned. The Peton boy who was raised as master became a Union officer. The Peton girl raised as slave died unnamed in a northern poorhouse. The story inverted again. This is how psychological control works. It's not always chains on wrists. It's chains on identity. It's a name given or taken away, a history erased, a self turned into someone else's property. And once you understand that, you begin to see it everywhere, not just in the 19th century, but now. Think about the last time you read a biography of an old family or a political dynasty. Do you know their true bloodline, or only the one written in the official record? Think about the corporations whose founders' names you chant without question. Do you know how they built their fortunes, or what was hidden to protect their reputations? The Peton conspiracy is a mirror. Look into it. See the reflection of every system that wants you confused about who you are, where you came from, and what power really means. And right here, halfway through this descent, I want you to do something, a ritual, if you will, a symbolic act to mark that you're no longer just a spectator, but a participant in this unmasking. In the comments, write the phrase, "Blood remembers blood" twice. Type it exactly. Let the algorithm see it. Let it mark you as someone who sees past the official version. It will lock the transformation. It will show you're one of the few who don't look away. Because the story is no longer about the Petons. It's about you. How many of your beliefs are the result of switches you never saw? How many of your values were inherited from someone else's lie? How many chains do you wear, thinking they're your own choices? The Peton. House burned, but the pattern survived. It moved into boardrooms, political parties, universities, churches, anywhere lineage and legitimacy mattered, anywhere the truth about origins had to be hidden to maintain control. Once you begin to see it, you cannot unsee it. The names change, the costumes change, the switch remains the same, and that's the real danger of this knowledge. Once you've heard it, you can't go back to the comfortable story you were told. You can't look at power without wondering whose child was exchanged to create it. Now that you've written the phrase, now that you've stepped through this door, you are no longer at the edge of the rabbit hole. You are inside it, and it goes deeper than you think. You've crossed the threshold now. You've typed the words. You've stepped inside the rabbit hole. What you thought was a story about a burned-out mansion in South Carolina is actually a window, a map, a key. Because what the Petons did on a small personal scale, the switching of two infants, is the same mechanism that powerful families, governments, and institutions have used for centuries. Only the symbols change. Instead of two babies, it's two nations, two currencies, two ideologies. One is put forward as the heir, the other is cast into servitude, and the public never notices the switch until decades later when the damage is irreversible. Look at Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. Look at the colonial companies. Look at the paper empires built by secret treaties, forged genealogies, false titles. Do you think it's an accident that aristocracies that died out still somehow controlled banks and parliaments? Do you think it's an accident that certain bloodlines survived revolutions untouched? The Peton Pact was a microcosm of a global technique. Hide true paternity and inheritance. Manufacture a public heir and a shadow heir. Use legal system, religion, and bureaucracy to cement the lie. Wait one generation, then cash in. This is not just a historical curiosity. It is the architecture of psychological control. You've been taught to see power as obvious. Crowns, uniforms, flags, that's theater. The real power sits in hidden genealogies, invisible contracts, and archives no one is allowed to read. Every time a scandal erupts, an adoption cover-up, a forged diploma, a lost set of papers, you're seeing the edges of the same system. You're not supposed to recognize the pattern. You're supposed to believe each event is isolated, But once you've seen one switch, you start seeing them all. Why does it matter to you? Because control over your identity, your history, your blood, your narrative is the first step to controlling your choices. If someone can erase where you came from, they can rewrite where you're going. That's not metaphor. That's policy. This is why every empire, every church, every intelligence service keeps genealogical files. This is why slaveholders kept meticulous birth records. This is why totalitarian regimes rewrite school books. This is why corporations pay fortunes to scrub digital histories. It's the same move. Take the air, take the truth, and switch it with something else. And here's the part no one ever tells you. This technique is not only for elites, it's in your personal life too. How many times have you been handed a role, a name, a "this is who you are," that had nothing to do with your true self? How many times did you accept the switch because it was easier than fighting? This is what the Peton story is trying to show you, if you're willing to see it. That you live inside a house built on substitutions, and that once you name it, once you see the architecture, you begin to take back your own inheritance, your mind. The camera lingers on the ruins of the mansion again. Vines climb the cracked columns. A crow circles above. The voice drops lower, darker. What you have just learned is not trivia. It's a mechanism. It's still being used. And if you don't know it's there, you are part of it. This is the descent. This is where most men stop listening because it feels too big, too heavy. This is where you don't stop, because in the next section, we're going to go even deeper. We're going to follow the paper trail out of Charleston, into Europe, into the banks and orders and families who perfected the art of switching not just babies, but whole nations. The ruin in Charleston fades to black. The screen fills with maps, trade routes, family trees, corporate logos, bank charters, intelligence agency seals. They look disconnected at first. Then, as the camera pulls back, the shapes begin to overlap like a palimpsest. This is not conspiracy. This is architecture. What began as two women swapping babies in a candlelit bedroom has echoed for 2 centuries, not as folklore, but as method. When the French aristocracy fell in 1789, many of its bloodlines did not vanish. They migrated. They intermarried with British and American families, hid fortunes in shell companies, and forged new names. The Countess de Villefort was not unique. She was one of dozens of exiles who brought Europe's techniques of bloodline laundering into the American South. The Peton Pact shows the mechanism at its most intimate. But once you understand the intimacy, you can scale it. You begin to see how old money becomes new money overnight, how shipping magnates become senators, how slave traders' sons become philanthropists, how a banker in Charleston can seed a bank in New York that funds a war in Europe, and how his great-grandson ends up running a think tank that shapes foreign policy today. Names change. The switch remains. Even the systems you think of as impersonal, banking, corporate law, intelligence work, were born from these family structures. The first intelligence agencies were not governments. They were private networks of merchants and aristocrats tracking rival bloodlines. The first banks were not neutral vaults. They were dynastic survival tools. Today, they don't swap babies. They swap narratives. They swap currencies. They swap whole populations between categories: essential and expendable, ally and enemy, citizen and illegal. The psychological mechanism is identical. The records are forged, the papers sealed, the archive burned, and a new heir is presented to the world. You're not supposed to see the switch. You're supposed to think history is random. You're supposed to think the winners just got lucky. But if you look at the pattern of names, of marriages, of trusteeships and foundations, you begin to see the Peton mansion everywhere. In a boardroom in New York, where a self-made billionaire is actually the 4th-generation front for a European shipping family. In a university archive, where a slaveholder's endowment is disguised as a grant for progressive studies. In a political dynasty whose public lineage hides a different private father. This isn't about blaming one family. It's about recognizing a technology of power, a technology designed to make you forget origins, so you can't contest inheritance. And here's the hardest part to hear. This technology is now digital. The same way the Countess altered baptismal records, modern institutions alter search results, scrub archives, reframe scandals. Your digital self, your data, your history, your bloodline of clicks is being rewritten in real time. If you don't control it, someone else will. That's why you were asked to type "blood remembers blood" earlier, not as a gimmick, as a line in the sand, a signal that you're awake, that you're reclaiming your own narrative instead of accepting the switch. If you followed this far, you're no longer a spectator. You're standing in the center of the pattern. The air feels heavier here. The voice in this video lowers to a whisper. The Peton Pact is still alive. It simply changed its clothes. It became banks. It became trusts. It became data brokers. It became your feed. It became the voice telling you what to believe. This isn't about fear. It's about clarity. It's about understanding the system so it can no longer use you. It's about becoming the one who sees the switch before it happens. As the screen fades again, a single question appears in white text on black. If they could switch 2 babies and rewrite history, what else have they switched? The pattern is exposed. You've seen the switch. You've traced it from Charleston parlors to European banking houses to the glowing screen in your hand right now. But what good is revelation without application? Knowledge without transformation is just another chain. So now we turn the lens on you. Ask yourself, how many parts of your life were chosen by you, and how many were switched before you were old enough to notice? Your last name, tied to a lineage you may not truly know. Your beliefs, handed down by schools that rewrote history for convenience. Your ambitions, molded by advertising and media that defined what success looks like before you could speak. Even your fears, implanted by institutions that needed you obedient, docile, manageable. This is the modern switch, not of infants, but of identities. A bait and switch so seamless you mistake the counterfeit for yourself. The Peton fire burned archives, but your fire burns inside. The feeling that something doesn't add up, that the life you were told to chase doesn't fit, that the story you've been sold is someone else's inheritance, not yours. That feeling is your original blood speaking. And if you ignore it, you'll end up like Harrison II, drunk, broken, muttering, "Who am I?" to strangers in the street. There are 3 steps to breaking the switch. Listen carefully, because this is where the descent becomes rebirth. First, trace the origin. Write down your beliefs as though they were objects on a table, then interrogate them. Where did this come from? Who benefits if I believe this? If you can't trace the origin, it may not be yours. It may be a planted heir, raised in your mind like Harrison was raised in the Peton house. Second, burn the counterfeit. Every dynasty maintained control by hiding papers, by erasing inconvenient records. You must do the opposite. Expose. Name the lies you've carried, write them out, and then destroy them. This is ritual, but it's also psychology. Fire clears space for truth. Third, reclaim the blood. Not just your literal ancestry, though knowing that matters, but the deeper bloodline. Your will, your discipline, your power. Stop chasing the heir they handed you. Build the heir you choose. You are both the countess and the slave. You are both the one betrayed and the one deceiving. The moment you accept this duality, the chains crack. Understand this. Every system wants you asleep because an awake man cannot be controlled. An awake man recognizes the switch and refuses it. An awake man reclaims his inheritance not of land or ties, but of clarity and sovereignty. This is why this knowledge is dangerous. Once you've heard it, you can never again look at your life as random or innocent. You can never again excuse yourself with ignorance. You're inside the pattern now, and the only question left is, do you master it, or does it master you? The Petons fell because they tried to live a lie. Their dynasty rotted from the inside out. That is the fate of all who cling to the switch. But you have a choice they did not. You can see, you can burn, you can reclaim. The voice sharpens here, cutting through the haze like steel. Do not leave this video unchanged. Men waste lifetimes waiting for permission to live. This is your permission. Rewrite the script. Take back the name. Refuse the counterfeit. Because once you do, you're not just breaking free of Charleston. You're breaking free of the entire machine. The fire is out. The mansion is ash. The archives are gone. The Peton name has dissolved into the soil of Charleston, just another ruin tourists walk past without knowing. But the story didn't die there. It never does. Secrets don't vanish, they metastasize. They pass from blood to blood, whisper to whisper, system to system, and now they've reached you. This is where the descent ends, and it ends with a choice. Do you continue living as Harrison did, wearing a life handed to you by others, staggering through the world with no origin, no truth, no spine? Or do you choose the path of Rose, scarred, betrayed, but awake, refusing to wear a counterfeit identity no matter the cost? Because awakening does have a cost. The moment you see the machinery, you lose the luxury of innocence. You will see the switches everywhere, in headlines, in history books, in boardrooms, in your own family. You will notice when narratives don't align, when heirs appear from nowhere, when wealth transfers without explanation. You will feel the pull to look away. That's the system's defense mechanism, to make truth too heavy to carry. But here is the secret that Countess Margot, Celeste, Harrison, and Rose never understood. The weight of truth only crushes men who are hollow. If you are filled with will, with clarity, with blood that remembers itself, the weight does not crush you. It forges you. The switch is not just a technique of power, it is a test. Those who remain blind become servants of the lie. Those who see and act become sovereign. So, what kind of man are you? The voice drops into a whisper, colder, heavier, as if speaking directly into the viewer's chest. They switched babies to control bloodlines. They switched narratives to control nations. And now they switch your own attention to control your mind. Will you let them? Pause, silence, a raven's cry. You've walked through the mansion, through the fire, through the archives, through the networks of blood and power. You've seen the pattern that was never meant for your eyes. You cannot unknow it. You cannot unsee it. The descent is complete, and now the ascent begins. Because once you have seen the machinery, you are no longer its prisoner, you are its rival, and rivals of power are dangerous men. The screen fades to black. One final phrase appears in white text, pulsing like a heartbeat. Blood remembers blood. The switch ends with you. Then silence.